Imagine the sheer ethical friction of a modern city under siege.
Right.
You know, you have millions of people packed into a dense grid of concrete and glass, and then you introduce a massive armed conflict right into that grid.
It's chaos.
Yeah, suddenly the clean lines of a traditional battlefield just vanish entirely. You
Yeah.
could literally have a civilian maternity hospital operating on one corner and a military ammunition depot sitting right on the same city block. Welcome to Reformed Thinking.
Glad to be here.
Today, we're cutting through the noise of the ongoing Ukraine-Russia conflict. We're looking directly at the brutal math of international humanitarian law.
Yeah, the secular framework.
Right. And we're asking a pretty provocative question. What strict moral limitations does the sovereign God place upon a government's right to pull the trigger?
It's a really heavy question.
Mm-hmm.
And to tackle it properly, we're looking at this crisis through two distinct lenses based on our provided source material.
Right, yeah.
First, we're going to look closely at the secular framework of the Geneva Conventions and international law. And second, we'll look at a strict theological exegesis of Romans chapter 13. We'll be evaluating the authority of the state through a reformed Christian worldview.
But, you know, before we get into the theology or the law, we have to grasp what's actually happening in these urban centers on the ground right now.
Yeah, let's start with the hard data.
Because when you read the reports coming out of the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, the numbers are just staggering.
They really are.
The sources indicate that 2025 was the deadliest year for civilians since the initial full-scale invasion back in 2022.
Right, we're looking at a 31% increase in casualties compared to the previous year.
That's a huge jump.
Yeah, specifically, the UN verified 2,514 civilians killed and over 12,000 injured in that single 12-month span. And the trend is accelerating. By May 2026, the conflict hit the highest monthly total of civilian casualties since April of 2022.
Just in May alone.
Yeah, in just that 1 month, at least 274 civilians were killed and over 1,700 were injured.
Those numbers represent a massive escalation, but we also need to understand how the UN actually gathers and verifies that data in the middle of a war zone.
Right, because this isn't a simple census.
No, not at all. The Human Rights Monitoring Mission uses a really rigorous methodology.
Right, they're cross-referencing overcrowded hospital admission records. They're analyzing satellite imagery of destroyed neighborhoods.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they interview first responders. They examine crater sizes to determine the type of munitions used.
So when they verify 12,000 injuries, that's really just a conservative baseline.
Yeah, the real number is likely much higher just due to the fog of war and areas that are completely inaccessible to international observers.
That makes the reality even more chilling. I mean, when you really think about it.
Definitely.
And what stands out in the reporting is how the delivery of this violence has shifted over time. In the early stages of the conflict, the world watched these brutal, grinding sieges of cities like Mariupol and Bakhmut.
Yeah, those were instances of absolute saturation.
Right, where wide-area explosive weapons just turned very dense neighborhoods into localized kill zones. But as the conflict evolved into 2025 and 2026, the nature of the threat expanded drastically.
That's spot on. The sources document a massive shift toward what military strategists call standoff fires.
Which means what in this context?
It means belligerents are launching long-range missiles and heavy glide bombs at urban centers situated far from the immediate front line.
Right, so we're talking about strikes on major metropolitan areas like Kyiv and Dnipro.
Yeah, you have a population trying to maintain a functioning economy, going to universities, going to grocery stores, while massive ballistic weapons are falling from the sky.
It's terrifying to even picture that.
And at the same time, the data shows that short-range drones have become the primary cause of casualties right at the physical front line.
Right.
That exposes not just residents, but rescuers and evacuation volunteers to this constant buzzing danger overhead.
So think about your own city for a second. Imagine the sheer biological makeup of it.
Like a living organism.
Yeah. The roads are the arteries, the electrical facilities, and water treatment plants are the vital organs. When warfare enters that environment, the entire city compresses.
Right. The military and civilian spheres are forced into the exact same physical space.
And the sources give this incredible, terrifying example of how this compression works in practice.
The bridge example.
Yeah, you have a single bridge over a river. At 8 o'clock in the morning, it carries military troops moving artillery to the front.
Right.
But then at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, it carries civilian ambulances rushing the injured to a hospital. It's the same concrete, the same asphalt.
And that compression extends to the infrastructure keeping the city alive, too. Consider a major railway station.
Right, it might be moving military shells and ammunition on one track.
Yeah, and on the very next track, just a few feet away, it's moving trains full of children fleeing the bombardment.
Wow.
Or a municipal energy grid. That single substation provides the electricity necessary to sustain a state defense industry manufacturing weapons.
Right.
But it simultaneously runs the life support ventilators in a civilian intensive care unit a few miles away. The systems are completely entangled.
So trying to target a single military objective in a functioning city it's like trying to extract a tumor with a wrecking ball.
That's a really good way to put it.
You might hit the tumor, but you're taking down the whole circulatory system with it.
Yeah.
Every strike breaks ribs, ruptures vessels, and destroys the very systems keeping the organism alive.
Yeah. And the reports detail how this dynamic is playing out across both sides of the conflict, which brings up a critical legal concept.
Right. The sources are very objective on this point.
They are. They note that Russia has generated the overwhelming burden of documented civilian casualties in Ukraine through these standoff bombardments.
Yeah.
However, the reports also clearly state that Ukraine has increasingly struck Russian territory using drones.
Targeting oil refineries, logistics hubs, and energy-related infrastructure.
Right. And what's vital to understand from a legal perspective is the concept of reciprocity.
Reciprocity, right.
Under international humanitarian law, both sides are bound by the exact same strict operational rules, regardless of who initiated the conflict.
Wait, let me make sure I have this straight.
Sure.
Even if a nation is fighting a lawful defensive war against an unprovoked aggressor, that defensive posture doesn't give them a blank check to ignore the rules of engagement.
That's right. International law strictly separates the reasons for going to war from the conduct within the war.
Interesting.
The law applies equally to the aggressor and the defender. Accusations of wrongdoing by one side do not settle the legality of the other side's actions.
Yeah.
The assessment of any single airstrike or artillery barrage depends strictly on target status, expected civilian harm, feasible alternatives, weapon choice, timing, intelligence.
Wow, that's a lot to weigh.
Yeah, and the anticipated concrete and direct military advantage. Retaliation does not suspend the Geneva Conventions.
So if we're looking at military commanders operating wrecking balls in these living, breathing cities, how does the international community even attempt to regulate this?
It's tough.
Like, how do you put rules on something that destructive? Our sources break down the legal framework governing these strikes into 4 main pillars.
Yeah, and I want to walk through these because they set the baseline for everything else we're going to discuss today.
Okay, let's hear the first one.
The first pillar is distinction. This is the absolute, non-negotiable requirement that armed forces must distinguish at all times between combatants and civilians.
Right, and between military objectives and civilian objects.
Yeah, you can only direct attacks against legitimate military objectives. But as we discussed with the compression of the city, this becomes incredibly difficult because of dual-use infrastructure.
Yeah, that railway station we talked about moving both kids and ammunition, that's the classic dual-use scenario.
Spot on. A civilian object only loses its protection and becomes a lawful military objective when its nature, location, purpose, or use makes an effective contribution to military action.
Right.
And its total or partial destruction has to offer a definite military advantage. But even when an object becomes dual use, the civilian population utilizing it does not lose their protection.
So if a commander successfully distinguishes a military train from a civilian one, they're technically in the clear on that first rule.
Yes.
But what happens when the weapon they choose, say an unguided heavy rocket, cannot be aimed precisely enough to hit just that military train?
That introduces a whole new legal nightmare.
Right, which brings us to the second pillar, the prohibition of indiscriminate attacks.
Indiscriminate attacks are explicitly forbidden. The sources highlight the International Committee of the Red Cross's specific warnings against using wide-area explosive weapons in populated areas.
Because they can't be contained.
Right. The Red Cross argues that heavy, unguided artillery, multiple launch rockets, and large aerial bombs simply cannot have their destructive effects limited in a dense neighborhood.
They spread out across a wide blast radius.
Yeah, a radius that inherently contains both military targets and innocent families living next door.
So if a weapon can't be directed at a specific military objective, or its effects can't be limited, its use is indiscriminate and therefore unlawful.
That's right.
Okay, let's say a commander uses a highly precise weapon, like a laser-guided missile. They have distinction, and they aren't being indiscriminate.
Okay.
But the target is an enemy command post located on the ground floor of a massive civilian apartment complex.
Yeah, that triggers the third pillar, proportionality. This seems to be the math of war.
Right, the math.
Proportionality is arguably the most complicated pillar. This rule dictates that even if a target is a perfectly lawful military objective, an attacker cannot launch a strike if the expected incidental civilian harm.
Meaning death, injury, or damage to civilian objects.
Right, if that harm would be excessive in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage anticipated from the strike. It requires commanders to forecast the outcome before they authorize the launch.
Which naturally moves us to the fourth pillar, precautions.
Because distinction and proportionality are just ideas on paper unless they're operationalized through concrete steps.
Right. Precautions are the mandatory operational choices a commander has to make. We're talking about changing the angle of an attack so debris falls into an empty lot instead of a school zone.
Yeah. Or it means altering the time of day to strike a rail yard at 3 in the morning when the nearby market is empty, instead of noon when it's packed with shoppers.
Or dropping leaflets, or sending mass text messages to issue advance warnings to civilians to evacuate a specific grid. Hold on, I have to stop you there and play devil's advocate for a second.
Go for it.
I watch the news, and every time a civilian building gets hit and people die, the immediate reaction on social media and from political pundits is to scream, war crime.
Yeah, you see that a lot.
Are you telling me international law actually allows for civilian deaths if a military spreadsheet says the strategic advantage is high enough? That sounds incredibly dark.
It is dark.
And on the flip side of that, if an enemy soldier decides to hide in the basement of a residential building, does that military presence make the whole building fair game?
The sources dismantle both of those assumptions very clearly, and the reality is indeed quite sobering. To your first point, no, a civilian death does not automatically equate to a war crime.
Wow, okay.
International humanitarian law actually permits attacks on military objectives even when some incidental civilian harm is expected.
That's wild to think about.
The legal requirement is that the expected harm must not be excessive in relation to the military advantage, and all feasible precautions must have been taken.
So it's entirely about what the commander knew beforehand, not just the tragic result after the fact.
Correct. The law demands honest, disciplined forecasting before the strike.
Right.
Legality is not determined by simply counting bodies after the dust settles. It turns on what was expected, or what should reasonably have been expected at the specific time the decision was made to fire.
What about the second point, the soldier in the basement?
Right. Regarding your second point, the presence of a soldier in an apartment building absolutely does not erase the civilian protections of everyone else living there.
Okay, that's a relief to hear, because the alternative would mean millions of people have zero legal protection the moment a soldier walks down their street.
Spot on. The fact that an object becomes dual use simply opens the door to a legal attack. It does not guarantee it.
They still have to do the math.
Right. The attacker still has to satisfy the rules of proportionality and precautions. If striking that single soldier in the basement would predictably collapse a 10-story building and kill 50 civilians, that strike would almost certainly be disproportionate and unlawful.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The expected civilian harm heavily outweighs the advantage of eliminating one foot soldier. Civilian life operates as a legal constraint with real veto authority over military action.
Okay, that makes sense on paper. But let's look at how this breaks down in reality. You mentioned proportionality.
Yeah.
It sounds very neat and tidy in a classroom at a military academy. You weigh the military advantage on one side of the scale and the expected civilian harm on the other.
Right.
But applying that mathematical equation in the chaos of a living, breathing urban environment seems nearly impossible.
It's incredibly difficult.
Which shifts our discussion to what the text calls the practical crisis of forecasting harm.
Proportionality is widely considered the most difficult targeting rule to apply in modern conflict. The core issue is that it asks commanders to compare entirely unlike things.
Right, apples to oranges.
Yeah. How do you mathematically weigh the strategic value of disabling an enemy radar system against the destruction of 3 civilian homes and a shattered water main?
There's no clean exchange rate for that.
No, there isn't.
No.
The text breaks down this practical crisis into 5 specific challenges, starting with the challenge of scope, or what military analysts call reverberating harm.
Let me offer an analogy for this one. Think about throwing a heavy cinder block into a small pond.
Okay, I've been picturing it.
The initial splash, right where the block hits the water, is the immediate blast, the fragmentation, the overpressure wave. But the ripples that travel outward and disrupt the entire surface of the pond, those are the reverberating harms.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah, a narrow view of proportionality only counts the civilians who might be killed by the immediate splash. But urban warfare demands a wider lens.
It really does. If you strike an electrical substation to stop a munitions factory, you don't just break concrete and copper wire, you stop the water pumps that provide drinking water to a massive residential district.
Wow, yeah.
You shut down the backup generators in the local hospital. You cut off the telecommunications network that civilians desperately need to receive evacuation warnings.
So the blast radius might be 50 meters, but the reverberating harm spans 50 square miles.
Right.
Which brings up a huge question. At what point is the commander no longer legally responsible for the furthest ripple? If they drop the cinder block, are they legally accountable for the ripple that hits the shore 3 days later?
That leads directly into the second challenge.
Time.
Time, right. The military advantage of a strike is usually immediate. A supply convoy is destroyed, which immediately reduces enemy artillery fire. But the civilian harm often unfolds days, weeks, or even months later.
Right, like the water pumps.
Yeah, a damaged water treatment plant might not kill anyone at the moment of impact, but the ensuing lack of sanitation could cause an outbreak of cholera or waterborne disease 2 weeks down the line.
So how much of that are they legally required to foresee?
Well, international law doesn't demand omniscience. It doesn't require a commander to perfectly predict remote, highly unlikely effects.
Okay.
But it does require the consideration of reasonably foreseeable direct and indirect harm. In a highly interconnected modern city, claiming ignorance of these ripples is increasingly difficult to defend in a legal setting.
And that assumes the commander has perfect visibility, which brings us to the third challenge, uncertainty.
Right, the sheer lack of perfect intelligence.
Yeah, a commander looking through a grainy drone feed might see a military vehicle parked outside a commercial building, but they can't see through the concrete roof.
They don't know if there are 30 civilians sheltering in the basement of that specific building.
Right, precisely. The text stresses that while uncertainty does not always prohibit an attack, it must heavily discipline the decision-making process.
It has to. If there's significant doubt about the civilian presence, the commander has an obligation to seek additional verification, use a lower-yield weapon, delay the strike until more intelligence is gathered, or cancel it entirely.
And this uncertainty is compounded by the fourth challenge, cumulative harm.
Yes.
This one feels particularly relevant to the data we looked at earlier. Proportionality is typically evaluated on a strict strike-by-strike basis.
Right. A lawyer looks at one missile hitting one target.
But civilians do not experience war one spreadsheet cell at a time. They experience it cumulatively.
Precisely. If a military launches repeated, sustained strikes across an entire national energy network during the freezing winter months, the baseline vulnerability of the population drastically changes.
Right.
A city that is already damaged, freezing, without electricity, and crowded with internally displaced people is far more fragile than a city functioning at peacetime capacity.
So the math changes entirely.
Yes. A strike that might have been considered mathematically proportionate in a healthy city could become wildly disproportionate in a severely degraded one, simply because the population has zero resilience left to absorb the shock.
Which brings us to the fifth and final challenge in the secular section, public relations.
The PR spin.
Yeah. The text notes this very cynical tendency for governments and militaries to hide behind simplistic slogans for domestic consumption.
Right.
One side will announce on television that every single target they hit was a valid military target, attempting to wash their hands of the collateral damage, as if the label solves the legal equation.
And the other side will point to every single shattered window and scream, terror, attempting to completely delegitimize the opponent's right to conduct military operations.
Right. Both of those slogans evade the actual rigorous legal question.
I do. Proportionality requires documented scientific evidence, target intelligence, weapon choice estimates, blast radius calculations, timing logs, and alternatives considered.
You have to show your work.
Yes, And without those meticulous records, the entire concept of proportionality becomes incredibly easy to abuse and almost impossible for international courts to audit after the fact.
So human law, international humanitarian law, is doing its best to put a leash on the horrors of war. But as we see in the news every day, that leash snaps constantly.
It's constantly strained.
Proportionality becomes an excuse. Public relations take over. Secular courts struggle immensely with the ambiguity of these ripples of harm. The rules exist, but they're constantly debated and, frankly, ignored in the heat of combat.
The limitations of secular law are painfully obvious when you look at the casualty statistics we discussed earlier.
Which brings up an older, much heavier question. If secular law is so easily broken by the state, what happens when we look at the state from a divine perspective?
Ah, right.
Does theology put a tighter leash on the military than Geneva does? We're shifting gears entirely now from the secular courts to a strict theological exegesis, bringing a reformed Christian analysis of warfare into view.
Yeah, the second half of our source material anchors this discussion in the Westminster Confession of Faith, specifically looking at chapter 23, section 2.
Right.
For context, this is a central document for understanding the historical Reformed Protestant perspective on civil government. The confession outlines that the civil magistrate, meaning the governing authorities of a nation, whether a president, a parliament, or a king, has a legitimate God-given function.
Okay, and what is that function?
That function is to maintain piety, justice, and peace. And to achieve that specific end, the confession explicitly states that magistrates may lawfully wage defensive war upon just and necessary occasion.
This is a fascinating contrast because the Reformed view presented here stands in direct opposition to two extreme positions that often dominate the conversation.
Right.
On one side, you have absolute pacifism, which argues that a Christian or a state can never use lethal force under any circumstance, essentially leaving the innocent defenseless against aggression. On the other side, you have unbridled Machiavellian realism, the idea that the state can do whatever it takes, however brutal, to secure its own survival and dominance.
The Reformed view cuts right down the middle of those two extremes. The state's lethality is sanctioned by God, yes, but only for the specific intent of restoring peace and only utilizing strictly necessary and proportionate means.
It's a delegated authority, not an absolute one.
Spot on. It is delegated.
To really grasp this, the text takes us back into history, to the specific context of the Apostle Paul's letter to the Romans.
Romans chapter 13.
Right. We're looking at Romans 13, which is the baseline biblical text on civil authority. We have to understand the environment in which Paul was writing this. He wrote this epistle around AD 57. The Roman emperor sitting on the throne at that time was Nero.
And Nero's Rome was a pagan empire that maintained the famous Pax Romana, the Roman peace. But we really have to understand what that peace actually looked like.
It wasn't peaceful.
No, it wasn't maintained through diplomatic negotiation. It was maintained through ruthless, overwhelming, and entirely indiscriminate violence.
Right.
The Roman legions would slaughter entire populations of conquered tribes, enslave the survivors, and flatten rebellious cities to the ground, simply to send a psychological message to other provinces.
That was the terrifying reality for the original audience in Rome reading Paul's letter.
Yes.
Imagine being a first-century Christian reading this letter in the shadow of the Colosseum, knowing what the Roman guards are capable of. This is exactly why Paul's letter is so incredibly subversive.
Yeah, it really is.
When you read Romans 13 on the surface, Paul is telling early Christians to submit to the government. A lot of people today read that and think Paul is just endorsing whatever the government does, writing a blank check for state violence.
But in the context of Nero's Rome, Paul was doing something radically different.
Right.
He was absolutely not endorsing Nero's tyranny. By telling the Roman Christians that all authority comes from God, Paul was systematically de-deifying the state.
Taking them down a peg.
Yeah. The Roman emperors claimed to be literal gods themselves. They demanded absolute worship and total autonomy.
Right.
Paul is writing to these vulnerable Christians, and he is telling the mighty Roman Empire that its emperors are not gods. They're nothing more than temporary delegated servants holding a leash that was handed to them by the sovereign God of the universe.
So the emperor thought he owned the world, and Paul is essentially saying you are just middle management and you report to a much higher boss.
That's a great way to summarize it.
That concept of delegated authority changes everything. The state does not possess inherent self-derived sovereignty. Its authority is entirely derivative, lent to it by the creator for a specific season and a highly defined purpose.
Right.
And to truly grasp how tight this divine leash actually is, the source text conducts a microscopic look at the specific Greek words Paul used in his letter.
Let's look closely at the lexical precision of this exegesis, because the original language completely shifts our understanding of modern warfare. Let's break down Romans 13:4.
Okay, let's hear it.
The grammatical breakdown is highly revealing. First, Paul refers to the ruler as a diakonos of God.
Okay, break that down for me. What does that word carry in the original Greek?
In our modern English Bibles, we often translate that as minister or agent. The Greek word implies someone who performs a subordinate task under the strict authority and direction of a master.
A servant.
Yes, the ruler has no autonomous authority. They act strictly as a subordinate, executing the will of the supreme judge. They're an agent of God's justice, not their own ambition.
Wow.
But the most revealing part of the exegesis is what the text calls the tale of two swords.
Right. Paul uses a very specific word for sword here to describe the state's lethality. He uses the Greek word machera.
Yes, machera historically refers to a short sword, a large dagger, or specifically a judicial executioner's knife.
A knife?
Yeah, it was the specific weapon carried by Roman provincial governors to symbolize their legal right to execute individual criminals after a trial. It is a tool of precise, surgical, targeted justice. Use a machera when you know specifically who the guilty party is.
And the text points out that this word choice is vital because of the word Paul deliberately bypassed. He could have used a different Greek word, rhomphaia.
Spot on. Rhomphaia denotes a massive, heavy, sweeping Thracian broadsword.
Just a huge weapon.
Yeah, it is a weapon designed for wide, indiscriminate carnage on a sprawling battlefield. You swing a rhomphaia when you want to take down as many people as possible without caring who they are.
Right.
By choosing machera instead of rhomphaia, Paul is conceptually anchoring the state's lethal authority to a highly targeted instrument of judicial execution, not an instrument of mass slaughter.
I haven't taken Greek since college, but the grammar of the verse restricts this even further, doesn't it? The text focuses heavily on the phrasing.
It does. Paul writes that the magistrate is an avenger for wrath to the one practicing evil. The Greek phrasing here uses a singular, dative, present, active participle.
Okay, let's translate that for the listener. What does a singular dative participle actually mean in practice?
Well, a participle is an action word, functioning like an adjective. Present active means the action is happening right now. Singular means the action is aimed at one specific person.
Just one.
Right. And the dative case indicates the direct recipient of the action. Syntactically, this is highly restrictive.
So it's zeroing in.
Yes. It means the wrath of the magistrate is grammatically and morally restricted to the specific, singular individual who is actively doing wrong at that moment. The magistrate is not authorized to pour out wrath upon a collective group, an entire geographic territory, or a civilian population simply because a criminal is hiding among them.
So let's actively apply this lexical breakdown to the modern weapons we were discussing in the first half of our deep dive.
Yeah.
If God specifically authorized the machera, the surgical targeted justice knife, and grammatically restricted that wrath to the singular guilty party, what does that say about modern urban warfare?
It creates a massive theological problem for modern military doctrine.
Right, because if a commander orders a strike using a modern equivalent of a rhomphaia, say, launching unguided heavy artillery barrages, or a massive 500-pound glide bomb that flattens an entire apartment block just to kill a few soldiers hiding in the basement, they are in direct, egregious violation of divine law.
That's right.
The subordinate agent is taking the master's tool and abusing it. They have turned a surgical instrument into a weapon of mass slaughter.
That is the inescapable conclusion of this theological framework. When a state discards these strict boundaries and engages in indiscriminate bombardment, it ceases to act as God's agent of justice.
It becomes something else.
It turns into an instrument of lawless violence, acting in rebellion against the very creator from whom it derives its authority. The text argues that any aimless or disproportionate deployment of military force in an urban zone is a direct violation of this divine restriction. It's an abuse of the delegated sword.
But history shows us, and the Daily News confirms, that human governments consistently fail to stay within these strict boundaries.
Unfortunately, yes.
Rulers have abused the sword for centuries, from Nero to the modern conflicts in Eastern Europe, which raises a massive theological question for the believer. If earthly justice is so consistently broken and the state constantly abuses its authority, where do you look for actual flawless justice?
The source makes a really interesting transition here. Because earthly rulers are blinded by sin, pride, and geopolitical ambition, and because they consistently abuse the sword, the text argues that this systemic failure should drive the believer to look toward Jesus Christ as the final, flawless fulfillment of the civil ruler.
Because human history is a painful chronicle of the failure of human magistrates.
Yeah.
And the text draws a stark contrast between how earthly kings operate and how Christ operated at his first advent. Earthly kings kill to maintain their thrones.
Yes. The exegesis points out that at his first advent, Christ did not come to wield the physical sword of the magistrate to establish an earthly kingdom. He didn't lead a military revolt against Rome.
Right.
Instead, he subjected himself to the unjust Roman sword. He allowed the state to execute him unjustly, acting as a substitutionary sacrifice.
Let's explain that term for a moment. Substitutionary sacrifice means he stepped in front of the blade to take the penalty for someone else.
Correct. He stepped in to satisfy the divine wrath of God against sin. He took the penal stroke of justice upon himself so that those who believe in him could be pardoned. He absorbed the wrath rather than inflicting it.
The source also lays out a very specific eschatological framework here. It maintains a sharp distinction between the church and geopolitical Israel.
Let's pause, because those are big theological concepts.
When the text talks about this, it's essentially arguing about timelines, right?
That's a highly accurate way to frame it.
Yeah.
This is a critical distinction in this theological system. The text argues that the church in the present age is not a geopolitical nation-state.
Right.
It is not called to wield the physical sword of steel, to conquer territory, or to establish a political theocracy right now. Human beings are too flawed to administer perfect justice.
So if the church isn't meant to run a physical global government now, when does that perfect justice happen?
This framework anticipates what the text refers to as the pretribulational rapture, followed eventually by a literal millennial kingdom.
Okay.
The theological assertion is that only in this specific future era, the millennial kingdom will Christ return to rule the nations physically, and when he does, he will rule with perfect, error-free justice.
He'll possess the omniscience that human commanders lack.
Yeah, he will abolish modern warfare entirely, turning swords into plowshares because the supreme magistrate has finally taken the throne.
So how does this eschatological view change the way a person processes the daily news? When you turn on your television or open an app on your phone and you see prosperous, modern Ukrainian cities that had cafes, universities, thriving economies, and traffic jams just a few years ago, reduced to absolute rubble in a matter of weeks.
It's devastating.
How does that act as a terrifying illustration of the temporary nature of all earthly security?
It forces a severe recalibration of where one places their hope. It is a stark reality check. The world constantly promises peace and safety through treaties and military deterrence. But the fragility of those concrete structures proves that earthly stability can vanish overnight.
If final hope cannot rest in the United Nations, in international diplomacy, or in the military might of secular alliances, it demands a different response entirely.
Yes, it does.
This leads to the final synthesis of our sources. What practical, immediate actions are demanded of the international community and the church right now in the midst of this brutal reality? Let's bring both of these lenses together, the secular law and the theological doctrine. What is the call to action?
Let's start from the legal international humanitarian law side. The sources outline several concrete, urgent demands for civilian protection that militaries need to adopt today.
Okay.
First, it calls for adopting a strong presumption against the use of wide-area explosive weapons in populated areas. It should not be a routine operational choice. It should be heavily restricted and stigmatized.
And what about accountability and tracking? We talked about the fog of war earlier.
Second, armed forces need to institutionalize civilian harm tracking. This means systematically recording and learning from past strikes. A military must build a database of their own operations.
Right.
If a certain type of missile repeatedly causes unexpected building collapse because of urban density, a military must adjust its future targeting parameters. They have to learn from their collateral damage.
That requires a level of transparency that most militaries instinctively fight against.
It does, which is why the third step is so critical. Legal review must be thoroughly embedded into the operational tempo.
What does that look like, practically?
You need legal advisors, intelligence officers, and civilian engineers, analyzing target sets like energy systems and real nodes before a strike is ever ordered. They need to identify civilian risk early enough in the kill chain to actually cancel or modify the operation.
And accountability is a huge part of this legal synthesis, right?
Yeah.
When the tracking shows a violation, what happens?
The sources discuss the critical need for strict accountability, referencing the ongoing investigations by the International Criminal Court into alleged war crimes.
Okay.
It stresses that accountability must be driven entirely by concrete evidence, satellite data, communications intercepts, crater analysis, not by political propaganda.
Right.
It must examine the documented patterns of attacks against civilians and hold both direct perpetrators and their commanding officers responsible for authorizing indiscriminate or disproportionate strikes.
Now, let's look at the theological call to action. What is the corporate duty of the church in the face of this warfare?
The theological source details a very specific corporate duty. It begins with fervent intercessory prayer for the protection of the innocent and for the restraint of oppressors.
But it goes beyond just prayer.
Yes, it goes far beyond prayer to physical action. The text calls for rendering physical, material aid to the victims through historically orthodox Protestant ministries that provide both relief for physical suffering, food, medical supplies, shelter, and spiritual care.
And there is a prophetic element to this as well, isn't there?
Yes. Finally, it demands bold prophetic clarity. The church is called to explicitly call out the actions of military commanders who use indiscriminate force, declaring it a direct, heinous sin against the sovereign God, not just a technical violation of a Geneva Convention.
I want to connect those two things, the secular demand and the theological reality. We talked about the IHL demand for civilian harm tracking, the idea that militaries need to keep databases of the collateral damage they cause. Think about that in light of divine judgment.
Yeah.
Military commanders might be able to classify their target data. They might be able to hide their civilian casualty numbers from the public press or from international human rights groups.
They can obscure the truth from human courts, certainly.
But they cannot hide a single data point from the Supreme Judge. Whether justice is carried out through an international tribunal at The Hague or in a final heavenly court, the text insists that every single drop of innocent blood is audited. The ledger is perfectly kept.
That is the final synthesis of these two sources. A state's lethal capability is never a blank check.
Right.
Both secular international law, through the rigorous application of proportionality and precautions, and strict biblical doctrine, through the limitations of the delegated sword, demand extreme precision, restraint, and accountability when operating in populated areas.
We've covered an immense amount of ground today. We started by looking at the terrifying statistics of urban warfare, the compression of civilian and military life, where hospitals and depots share the same block.
Yeah.
We walked through the secular rules designed to regulate the wrecking ball of war and the incredible difficulty of forecasting reverberating harm when you drop a stone into a pond.
Right.
And then we shifted to see how a strict, reformed exegesis of Romans 13 strips the state of its autonomous authority, demanding that the sword be used only as a surgical instrument of precise justice, pointing us finally to the perfect justice of Christ.
It is a sobering reflection on both the fragility of human institutions and the rigorous demands of divine justice.
I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over long after this audio ends. If human governance is essentially a temporary administration of justice, an administration that so consistently fails to protect the innocent despite centuries of writing international laws, how does that shift your expectations of what political or military solutions can actually achieve in our current era?
Yeah.
When you realize the absolute fragility of our modern cities, does it compel you to rethink where you place your final trust for safety and true justice? Thank you for joining us for this session of Reformed Thinking. We will catch you next time.